make this decision, as she makes every decision, in the best interest of the American people.
Kamala Harris is going to beat him in a debate, and is going to beat him on November 5th, and is going to be our next president.
You make that bastard wake up afterwards and know that a black woman kicked his ass and sent him on the road.
Welcome back to State of the Union. Vice President Kamala Harris is meeting today with her vice presidential pick finalists. My panel is here to talk about that now. I'll start with the Democrats to see, well, Democrat who likes
temporarily
temporarily
a Democrat.
Kamala Harris, supporters of Kamala Harris.
That's
How about
right.
that? What do you think? What should she do?
I think they all are great options.
No, that's such a
No, I think they all are great options. I think that they offer something different in the ticket. I actually, honestly, most of the time I have a very strong opinion. I don't have a strong opinion. I think if she goes with Shapiro, it makes a really strong case for Pennsylvania. But I also know with Shapiro, some folks in the party will want to know, like, well, what is the position on suffering people in Palestine, and how will we end the war in the Middle East, which is a fair request to know from a future or a presidential candidate. Walz will have to do more introduction to the country. I think he probably is a name that most people haven't heard of as much, but has a great record as a governor. And then if you have Kelly, Arizona, there's a conversation to have about immigration. So I think they are all a great choice. At the end of the day, it will be who she has good chemistry with and feels like I can run a campaign in 95 days and win, and then I can lead this country for 4 years, maybe even 8.
So you have a unique position. Welcome. Nice to see you. Jeff Duncan, you're the former lieutenant governor of Georgia, serving as a Republican there. You now support Kamala Harris because of who she's running against. Your unique perspective is that, I guess, who are Republicans most worried about?
Well, I think Kamala Harris has de-risked her finalist list. There's really no mistake in that list. There's no chance of her doing a J.D. Vance selection, right, and just being, doing harm to the ticket. So I do think the blocking and tackling of simple math is Pennsylvania. I think Republicans would be scared to see a governor of Pennsylvania almost instantly flip that state to being, a loss for the Democrats to being a win for the Democrats. I think that then creates regional creep, and you could probably get Michigan to come along in other states. So I do think it creates momentum. But at the end of the day, she doesn't have a liability on her hands with whoever she picks.
I want to turn to something that just came out, and that is a brand new poll out of CBS YouGov, and it shows a razor thin margin at the top, virtual dead heat. Vice President Harris at 50%, former President Trump at 49%. But look at what it says about black voters. Among black voters, they say they will definitely vote. 58% say they will definitely vote. That was in July 18th, rather. Now, 74% say they will definitely vote.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's an increase that's necessary, but it's still not high enough. I mean, the vice president's going to have to get 90% or more. She's still behind, but there's 90 plus days. I'm imagining the campaign is going to continue to work on that. I think she's going to have some issues with some younger black men. I got a feeling they're probably working on that. Ashley, you would know better than I would know. But I want to touch on the Shapiro issue. I think out of all of the possibilities, he would potentially be the worst one if I'm looking at Michigan. You're seeing resurfacing past
worst for Democrats or for
Democrats
for Republicans?
and for Vice President Harris to win the state of Michigan. Past statements are coming up about things he stated in the past about the Palestinian people. Some of his rulings as governor as it pertains to state workers and their potential advocacy, which could thus lead them to being fired, has caused quite the conundrum and criticism from younger progressives. I think there's a large percent of Muslims in the state of Michigan that would absolutely stay home. I went to look at some of those numbers in 2020 compared to now. The vice president cannot afford to lose a substantial number of them. So I would look at someone else. If I were Democrats, I don't think that would be the best pick strategically.
Sure, Michael. Josh Shapiro's position on Israel, on Netanyahu, on the Middle East, on protests is almost identical to the other Democrats she's talking to. The only difference is that he's Jewish.
Yeah.
So should she just give in to that?
Well, you know where I stand on that issue. I'm as pro-Israel as they come, and I've had many conversations about that. But I think that it speaks to a bit of the problem with younger progressive Democrats and the ceasefire. I think likely we'll see protests return again to college campuses. You and I have had those conversations. I certainly don't think it's a good thing, but it showcases within the Democratic Party there is at least, and I wouldn't say broadly speaking, but there is the appearance of some level of anti-Zionism. I'll put it that way at best, and that's a problem.
Let me bring Matt in.
Well, look, I think, you know, to Jeff's point, she's picked essentially folks who have been largely vetted, who have been largely, you know, gone through the ringer, so to speak, in her final selection here. Now, I do agree with Michael. At the end of the day, this is going to be about which candidate can unite the largest share of their party. There's an ever decreasing number of undecided voters, so it's going to be about, can Kamala Harris unite more Democrats or can Donald Trump unite more Republicans? To the extent that Josh Shapiro would divide Democrats, I find morally reprehensible. I think it's awful that the level of anti-Semitism that we see among largely the progressive left, not exclusively, but largely, and that is what might actually factor in. I hope, in a lot of ways, Vice President Harris actually steps through that and says, you know what, I don't care. I'm going to actually stand up to my own party on some of this. I'm going to actually say we're going to pick potentially the next Jewish vice president. Now, at the end of the day, I do think we have to get back to the core of one thing, though. Donald Trump isn't wrong when he says that voters are going to vote on the top of the ticket, not on the second for the vice presidential nominee. We see that consistently year after year, every cycle. We have a lot of conversation. We dedicate a lot of airtime to who the vice presidential nominee may be. But ultimately, it's going to be about Trump versus Harris.
Let me get you in, and then I want to turn to Georgia.
I thought about this, so I reached out to some folks last night who have been a part of the uncommitted movement. And it's not about a person's identity, it's about their policy. Folks want a ceasefire in the Middle East. They want people to be safe, to be able to live, and to be able to thrive. And whoever the vice president selects, that's the overwhelming census for the Democratic Party as well. And so whoever the vice president picks, that is what they want the policy to be. It's not about, she knows what it means to be a history maker. She is making history every single day. So she understands how important it would be to a community to have the first Jewish person on the ticket. It's about the policy, not about the actual person.
Let's talk about Georgia last night, because the former president went down. He actually spoke in the same arena that Kamala Harris did earlier in the week. And he certainly had his attack lines, many of them on Kamala Harris. But he also went after the sitting governor, who happens to be a Republican. Let's listen.
Your governor, Kemp, and Raffensperger are doing everything possible to make 2024 difficult for Republicans to win. Kemp is very bad for the Republican Party. He wouldn't do anything. He could have ended the travesty with a phone call because I did nothing wrong.
Kemp is your former boss.
We served together for sure. Brian Kemp has forgotten more about being a Republican than Donald Trump knows about being a Republican. Brad Raffensperger and myself included, we have done more for the conservative cause than Donald Trump has ever done. This is now starting to not be Donald Trump's problem. This is starting to be the Republican Party's problem. We have to call him out for what he is. He's a felonious thug who walks down the street and throws sucker punches at people like Brian Kemp, like African-American journalists, like John McCain, and the list goes on and on and on again. And the Republican Party is content sitting across the street watching it happen and not calling him out, not jumping into that fight and saying, you are wrong for us. This 10% in the middle, which now feels like it's growing to be bigger than 10% in the middle, that's going to decide this election, are paying attention. And I've never seen a human be more self-destructive than Donald Trump the last 2 weeks. He continues to do it over and over and over again. And when he loses, and the Republican Party finally catches their breath and wakes up and says, we need a GOP 2.0, there'll be some people around, but it's going to take time to fix. My hope is that Kamala Harris ends up being a blank canvas for us to be able to help work these new policies and new ideas into place. That's the risk I'm taking as a Republican voting for Kamala Harris.